The year was 1914, and the morning mist rolled softly across the Chilean coastline near Coronel, where the Pacific Ocean whispered its eternal lullabies against the rocky shores. Here, far from the thundering guns that would soon echo across European fields, a small detachment of Circassian cavalry had made their temporary home, their canvas tents arranged in neat rows like sleeping moths against the hillside. Captain Alexei Kadzi sat quietly outside his tent, watching the sun paint the eastern sky in shades of amber and rose. The morning air carried the familiar sense of military life, the earthy smell of horses, the smoke from cooking fires just beginning to kindle, and the sharp tang of sea salt drifting inland. His weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of what the British advisors called gunfire, the strong, sweet tea that marked the beginning of every military day. The Circassian cavalry had arrived in Coronel 3 months prior, part of a complex web of military advisors and observers that crisscrossed the globe in those final months before the world would change forever. Alexei's unit, descendants of the proud mountain warriors of the Caucasus, had been invited by the Chilean government to help modernize their cavalry techniques. It was peaceful work, far removed from the tensions building in Europe, though news traveled slowly but surely even to this distant corner of the world. As the camp began to stir, Alexei could hear the soft nickering of horses and the gentle clanking of metal as the cooks prepared the morning meal. The food in this remote posting was a curious mixture of military necessity and local abundance, so different from the harsh mountain fare of his homeland, yet bound by the same universal rules that governed all military provisioning. The quartermaster, a meticulous man named Ibrahim who had served with Alexei for 7 years, emerged from the supply tent with his daily ledger. Every morsel of food, every tin of preserved meat, every sack of flour was recorded in his neat script. In the military, food was more than sustenance, it was morale, it was discipline, it was the very foundation upon which all else rested. "Good morning, Captain," Ibrahim said softly, his voice carrying the musical accent of their shared heritage. "The morning rations are being prepared. We have received fresh supplies from the town, bread, some vegetables, and the fishermen brought their catch before dawn." Alexei nodded slowly, appreciating the rhythm of this information, the predictable comfort of military routine. In a world where so much was uncertain, where telegrams brought news of increasing tensions in lands far away, there was something deeply soothing about the simple certainty of breakfast. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the camp as the men gathered for their morning meal. The sound of their movement was like a gentle symphony, the soft shuffle of boots on packed earth, the quiet conversation in multiple languages, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables in the field kitchen. The field kitchen was the heart of the camp, a collection of large iron pots suspended over carefully tended fires. The cooks, led by an older Circassian named Murat who had learned his trade in the Ottoman armies, worked with practiced efficiency. The morning meal in a cavalry camp followed patterns established over centuries of military tradition, adapted to local conditions but fundamentally unchanged in its purpose, to provide energy for the day's duties while using resources that could be transported and stored effectively. The bread was always the foundation. Here in Coronel, they were fortunate to have access to a local baker who delivered fresh loaves 3 times a week. On other days, the men made do with hardtack, those infamous square biscuits that could survive months of storage but required strong teeth and stronger determination to consume. Alexei watched as the younger soldiers dunked their hardtack in their tea, softening it enough to chew, a technique as old as military service itself. In my grandfather's time, Murat said quietly as he stirred a large pot of porridge, during the long campaigns in the Caucasus, they would soften their dried bread in snow melt. We are fortunate here, with the sea breeze keeping our stores from molding in fresh supplies from the town. The porridge itself was a simple affair, oats or barley, depending on what the quartermaster had procured, cooked slowly with water and a precious bit of salt. Some mornings, when supplies were good, Murat would add dried fruits or a spoonful of the condensed milk that came in tins marked with British labels. The men would queue quietly, their metal bowls and spoons creating a gentle percussion as they waited their turn. For the officers, there might be an egg, when the local farmers had surplus, or a slice of the preserved meat that came wrapped in cloth and sealed with wax. These provisions traveled from distant ports, bearing stamps and markings from England, Argentina, and Australia. The global nature of military supply chains was already evident in 1914, though few could imagine how much more complex they would become in the years ahead. Alexei took his portion and returned to his observation post, eating slowly and mindfully. Each bite was a reminder of the delicate logistics that kept an army fed. He thought of the storage techniques they employed, the root cellars dug into the hillside where potatoes and turnips rested in cool darkness, the smoking shed where fish and meat hung in aromatic preservation, the careful rationing that ensured no man went hungry even when supplies ran low. As the morning progressed and the sun warmed the Chilean landscape, the camp settled into its daily rhythm. The sound of horses being groomed mingled with the distant call of seabirds, creating a peaceful soundscape that belied the military nature of the establishment. Ibrahim's supply tent was a marvel of organization. Shelves constructed from local timber held tins and boxes in neat rows, each labeled in multiple scripts: Arabic, Russian, and Spanish. The preservation of food in 1914 was an art form refined over decades of military experience. Canned goods, still relatively expensive but increasingly common, sat alongside traditional preserved foods that had sustained armies for centuries. "Come, Captain," Ibrahim said, gesturing to his domain with quiet pride. "Let me show you this week's inventory." Understanding our supplies helps understand our situation. The tent smelled of burlap and dried goods, with undertones of the lamp oil used to keep moisture at bay. Ibrahim's ledgers, bound in leather and marked with the seal of the Circassian regiment, contained detailed records of every item. The daily ration for each man was precisely calculated: 1.5 pounds of bread or 1 pound of hardtack, 1 pound of fresh meat or 3/4 of a pound of preserved meat, vegetables when available, tea, sugar, and salt. The preservation methods, Ibrahim explained, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher, they are both ancient and modern. "See here," he gestured to a section containing tins of bully beef, that ubiquitous military staple. "These can last for years if kept dry." The British perfected the canning, but the principle is as old as time: keep air and moisture away, and food remains wholesome. Next to the modern canned goods sat more traditional preserves. Dried fruits from the local markets, apricots, figs, and raisins, provided essential nutrients and a touch of sweetness to break the monotony of standard rations. Sacks of dried beans and lentils, which could be soaked and cooked into filling stews, lined the lower shelves. Barrels of salted fish, purchased from the Coronel fishermen and preserved using techniques passed down through generations, stood in the corner. In the mountains of our homeland, Ibrahim continued, we would preserve meat by drying it in the wind and sun, seasoned with salt and herbs. Here, with the humid sea air, we must use different methods, smoking, heavy salting, or the modern canning when we can afford it. The challenges of feeding a military unit went beyond mere preservation. Transportation was a constant concern. Everything had to be portable, able to withstand the jolting of wagon travel or the swaying of pack animals. Packaging was crucial, wooden crates reinforced with metal bands, canvas sacks treated with oil to repel moisture, ceramic jars sealed with wax. As the noon hour approached, bringing with it a gentle warmth that made the sea breeze especially welcome, the camp's attention turned to a matter of military justice. The maintenance of order in any military establishment required a careful balance of discipline and understanding, especially in a unit far from home. The Circassian cavalry operated under a hybrid system of justice, combining their traditional laws with the military codes adopted from European armies. Captain Alexei served not only as a military commander but also as a magistrate for minor offenses, while serious crimes would be referred to a formal military tribunal. That morning, a case required his attention. Private Dmitry Barakov, a young soldier barely 20 years old, had been caught stealing extra rations from the supply tent. In the civilian world, such theft might be considered minor, but in military life, where precise rationing could mean the difference between sustaining a campaign and failure, it was a serious offense. The impromptu court was held in the shade of a large tent, with the accused standing before a simple wooden table that served as the judge's bench. The proceedings were conducted with quiet dignity, the soft murmur of testimony barely disturbing the peaceful afternoon. Military justice in 1914, particularly in remote postings, relied heavily on the wisdom and discretion of commanding officers. Private Barakov, Alexei spoke in measured tones, his voice carrying the weight of authority tempered with understanding. You are accused of taking rations beyond your allocation. This is not merely theft from supplies, but from your brothers in arms. What have you to say? The young man's response revealed a common story. He had been sending most of his pay home to support his widowed mother and younger siblings, keeping so little for himself that he could not purchase additional food from the local markets when the standard rations left him hungry after particularly strenuous training. The punishment system in military camps of this era ranged from minor corrections to serious consequences. For small infractions, there might be extra duties, what the British called Yankeers, spending free time cleaning equipment or maintaining the camp. More serious offenses could result in reduction in rank, loss of pay, or confinement. The camp's makeshift prison was a small, sturdy building of local construction, more secure storage than true jail. It contained 2 cells with simple wooden bunks and basic amenities. The conditions, while austere, were not cruel. Prisoners received the same rations as other soldiers, had access to books and writing materials, and were allowed exercise periods in the small courtyard. The purpose of military punishment, Alexei explained to his junior officers afterward, is not vengeance but correction. A soldier who understands his error and accepts his punishment with dignity remains a soldier. One who is broken by excessive harshness becomes useless to the regiment. For Private Barakov, the sentence was 14 days of additional duties and a supervised payment plan that would ensure he kept enough of his wages for personal necessities. It was a solution that maintained discipline while showing the paternal care that good officers extended to their men. As the sun began its descent toward the Pacific horizon, painting the sky in soft pastels of pink and gold, the camp prepared for the day's second substantial meal. The evening air carried a cooling breeze that rustled through the tent flaps and brought relief from the day's warmth. The evening meal was traditionally more elaborate than breakfast, when time and supplies permitted. Murat and his assistants had been preparing since mid-afternoon, their cooking fires sending aromatic smoke drifting across the camp. Tonight's menu centered on a stew, a practical dish that could feed many men efficiently while making use of whatever ingredients were available. The base was bone broth, made from beef bones acquired from the local butcher, simmered slowly since dawn with bay leaves and peppercorns. To this, Murat added chunks of meat, some fresh, some from the preserved supplies, along with potatoes, onions, and carrots from the root cellar. The vegetables were cut into uniform pieces, a practice that ensured even cooking and fair distribution among the men. In the military kitchen, Murat explained to a young cook in training, his voice gentle and patient, "We must think always of equality. Every man's bowl must contain the same nourishment. This is not merely about food, it is about justice, about brotherhood." The bread for evening meals was often different from the morning's allocation. If fresh bread was unavailable, the cooks would prepare a simple flatbread on iron griddles, mixing flour with water and a pinch of salt, then cooking the discs over the fire until they developed golden spots. These could be used to soak up the stew's broth, ensuring nothing was wasted. For the Circassian cavalry, meals also carried cultural significance. Before eating, many of the men would observe a moment of quiet gratitude, a practice from their mountain homeland. The older soldiers would sometimes share stories of legendary feasts from their history, when warriors would gather after victories to share simple meals that bonded them as brothers. As darkness settled over the camp, small groups of soldiers gathered around their fires, their quiet conversations creating a peaceful murmur. Some played traditional instruments, a balalaika here, an accordion there, the music soft and contemplative. Others wrote letters home by lamplight, their pens scratching quietly on paper as they described their daily lives in this distant posting. The night deepened, bringing with it the sounds of the nocturnal world, the distant crash of waves against the shore, the occasional call of a night bird, the soft snorting of horses in their paddock. The camp settled into its nighttime rhythm, with sentries taking their posts and most men retiring to their tents. Alexei took a turn at night inspection, walking quietly through the camp with a small lantern. The storage areas required particular attention during the night hours, when the cool temperatures helped preserve foods but also attracted scavengers. The techniques for food preservation used by the military in 1914 were a mixture of ancient wisdom and modern innovation, each method carefully chosen for specific purposes. In the smoking shed, fish and strips of meat hung from wooden beams, the smoke from smoldering wood chips creating an environment hostile to bacteria while imparting flavor. The process could take days, requiring constant attention to maintain the proper temperature and smoke density. The resulting preserved meats could last for weeks without refrigeration, crucial for military operations where fresh supplies might be uncertain. The pickle barrels contained vegetables preserved in brine, cucumbers, cabbage, and beets, their acidic environment preventing spoilage while providing essential nutrients that prevented scurvy. The technique was thousands of years old, yet remained one of the most reliable methods of preservation available to military quartermasters. During the Napoleonic Wars, Ibrahim had once told him, armies discovered that pickled vegetables could mean the difference between victory and defeat. An army with scurvy cannot march, cannot fight. These simple barrels contain military strategy as much as food. The dry stores were equally important. Flour, kept in metal-lined boxes to prevent moisture and pests, could be transformed into bread, dumplings, or hardtack as needed. Rice, imported from Asia, provided a shelf-stable starch that could be prepared quickly. Dried beans and lentils, when soaked overnight and cooked slowly, created filling meals that sustained hardworking soldiers. Salt, perhaps the most crucial preservative, was stored with religious care. It served triple duty, preserving food, seasoning meals, and maintaining the body's essential chemical balance. The large salt casks, sealed with wax and marked with warnings about moisture, represented one of the most valuable commodities in the military supply chain. In a quiet corner of the camp, separated by a wooden fence topped with lanterns that cast a gentle glow, stood the military detention facility. It was a modest structure, more symbolic of order than a place of harsh punishment, reflecting the philosophy of military justice in this remote posting. The prison conditions in military camps of 1914 varied greatly depending on location and commanding officers. Here in Coronel, under Alexei's leadership, the approach was one of rehabilitation rather than pure punishment. The 2 cells were simple but clean, with straw mattresses that were changed weekly and wool blankets for the cool nights. Currently, only 1 cell was occupied. Corporal Petrov had been sentenced to 7 days confinement for being drunk on duty, a serious offense that could have resulted in much harsher punishment under a stricter commander. The daily routine for military prisoners was carefully structured to maintain discipline while preserving dignity. At dawn, prisoners were awakened by the same bugle call as the rest of the camp. They received the standard breakfast ration, brought by the guard on duty, the same porridge, bread, and tea as their free comrades. This equality in feeding was important for morale. A soldier being punished was still a soldier, still part of the unit. The morning hours were spent in labor, but not the backbreaking, punitive work sometimes associated with military punishment. Instead, prisoners might repair equipment, sew torn uniforms, or prepare vegetables for the kitchen, useful tasks that contributed to the camp's functioning while providing occupation for idle hands. The devil's workshop is an idle mind, the chaplain, Father Gregory, would say during his weekly visits to the prisoners. These spiritual consultations were voluntary but most attended, finding comfort in the familiar rituals and the opportunity for reflection. Lunch for prisoners was taken in their cells, a simple meal, perhaps bread and soup, but adequate and nutritious. The afternoon might bring educational activities. Illiterate soldiers could receive basic reading lessons, while others might study military regulations or learn practical skills like basic medical care or equipment maintenance. The prison guards, rotated regularly to prevent either excessive familiarity or animosity from developing, were instructed to maintain professional distance while treating prisoners with basic respect. They carried no weapons beyond a wooden truncheon, and physical punishment was forbidden except in cases of violence or escape attempts. As the days passed in gentle routine, the sound of the sea providing a constant, soothing backdrop to camp life, various minor infractions and their resolutions painted a picture of military justice in this era. The afternoon sun filtered through the tent where Alexei reviewed the month's disciplinary records with his adjutant. The most common crimes in military camps of 1914 were remarkably consistent across all armies. Drunkenness topped the list, especially in postings where local alcohol was readily available. The Chilean wine and pisco found their way into the camp despite regulations, leading to predictable problems. Last month, the adjutant reported in his quiet, methodical voice, "We had 7 cases of intoxication. 5 were minor. Men returned late from town leave, singing too loudly. They received extra duties. 2 were more serious, fighting while drunk. They spent 3 days in confinement." Theft, usually petty, was the second most common offense. Sometimes it was food, as with Private Barakov. Other times, personal items, a better pair of boots, a warmer coat, tobacco, or the small luxuries that made military life more bearable. The punishments varied based on what was stolen and why. A man stealing from necessity might receive lighter punishment than one stealing from greed. Insubordination, that cardinal military sin, was surprisingly rare in the Circassian unit. The strong cultural traditions of respect for authority, combined with Alexei's fair leadership, created an environment where direct challenges to order were uncommon. When they did occur, they were usually the result of misunderstandings or momentary anger rather than genuine rebellion. In the German army, visiting Major Wilhelm Schmidt had observed, insubordination might result in imprisonment with hard labor. In the French Foreign Legion, it could mean the infamous tombeau, solitary confinement in a cell barely large enough to stand. Here, you handle such matters with greater wisdom. Desertion, the most serious common crime, was virtually unknown in this posting. Where would a man go? The Circassians were thousands of miles from home, in a country where they barely spoke the language. The few attempts at unauthorized absence were usually men overwhelmed by homesickness who returned voluntarily within days. The military trial process for serious crimes was formal and methodical. A court-martial would consist of 3 officers, with the accused permitted to speak in his own defense and call witnesses. Evidence was presented carefully, with written records kept of all testimony. The proceedings, while lacking the elaborate legal representation of civilian courts, aimed for fairness within the constraints of military necessity. October arrived in Coronel with subtle changes. The air grew crisper, the evening light took on a golden quality, and the local markets filled with the abundance of harvest season. The camp's food supply improved considerably as local farmers brought their surplus to market. This seasonal abundance presented both opportunities and challenges for military provisioning. Ibrahim worked closely with local suppliers, negotiating prices and arranging for preservation of the perishable bounty. The root cellars were expanded, new smoking racks constructed, and every available container pressed into service for pickling and preserving. The process of transforming fresh produce into preserved military rations was labor-intensive but essential. Apples were sliced thin and dried in the sun, creating leathery rings that would reconstitute in water or could be eaten as they were. Cabbages were shredded and packed into barrels with salt, beginning the fermentation process that would create sauerkraut, a source of vitamin C through the winter months. Watch and learn, Murat instructed his kitchen assistants as they prepared a batch of preserved meat. First, the salt cure, coarse salt mixed with a small amount of saltpeter for color, brown sugar for flavor. Rub this mixture into every surface of the meat, then pack it in more salt. After 3 days, we smoke it. After smoking, we wrap it in clean cloth and seal with wax. Properly done, this meat will remain good for 6 months. The cavalry horses also benefited from the harvest. Hay was cut and stored in large stacks, covered with canvas to protect from rain. Oats and barley were purchased in bulk, stored in the expanded warehouse that Ibrahim had requisitioned. A cavalry unit's horses consumed enormous quantities of feed, each horse requiring approximately 20 pounds of hay and 10 pounds of grain daily, making their provisioning as complex as feeding the men. The improved food situation had noticeable effects on camp morale. Men smiled more readily, worked with greater energy, and the minor infractions that plagued all military units decreased. Good food, Alexei reflected, was indeed the foundation of good discipline. Evening meals became more elaborate. Murat experimented with local recipes, adapting them to military kitchens and available ingredients. A Chilean stew called charcacan, traditionally made with dried meat, potatoes, and vegetables, became a camp favorite. The dried meat component aligned perfectly with military preservation techniques, while the vegetable ingredients could be varied based on availability. As November began, bringing news of escalating tensions in Europe, the camp received visitors, a delegation of British military observers who had come to study the Chilean army's modernization efforts. With them came new ideas about military provisioning and camp management. Colonel James Hartwell, the senior British officer, was particularly interested in the fusion of traditional Circassian methods with modern military practices. Over dinner, a carefully prepared meal showcasing both local and military cuisine, he shared insights from British military kitchens around the empire. In India, he said, his voice carrying the measured tones of long military service, we learned that local spices not only improve the taste of basic rations but have preservative qualities. Turmeric, black pepper, coriander, they inhibit bacterial growth while making even the most monotonous provisions palatable. The British had brought gifts, tins of jam from Scotland, processed cheese that could withstand tropical heat, and a new type of compressed vegetable tablet that, when dissolved in hot water, created instant soup. These innovations fascinated Ibrahim, who carefully noted each item's composition and preservation method. The future of military provisioning, Colonel Hartwell predicted, lies in such concentrated foods. Imagine a week's nutrition in a pack small enough to carry in one's pocket. The Germans are experimenting with meat extracts, the Americans with condensed milk. War, if it comes to Europe, will be won by the nation that can best feed its armies. The British visit also brought changes to the camp's justice system. They shared their experiences with field punishment regulations, their systematic approach to maintaining discipline in far-flung imperial postings. The British system was more codified than the Circassian traditional methods, with specific punishments prescribed for specific offenses. Field punishment number 1, the British adjutant explained, though it was not practiced in this peaceful camp, involves restraining a man to a fixed object for up to 2 hours per day. It's controversial, even among our own officers. Here, your methods seem more effective, maintaining discipline through respect rather than fear. The cultural exchange extended to cooking techniques. The British cook demonstrated the preparation of bully beef stew, a dish that could be made from canned meat, whatever vegetables were available, and thickened with flour or crushed hardtack. It was practical, filling, and could be prepared in large quantities with minimal equipment. December arrived with unexpected rains that turned the camp into a muddy challenge. The sound of rain pattering on tent canvas became a constant companion, creating a rhythmic, soothing backdrop to daily activities. The moisture brought new concerns for food storage and preservation. Ibrahim supervised the construction of additional covered storage areas, raised platforms that would keep supplies above potential flooding. Every piece of food storage wisdom accumulated over centuries of military campaigns was employed. Double wrapping for dried goods, extra vigilance in checking for mold, frequent rotation of stores to ensure older supplies were used first. The rainy season affected cooking as well. Outdoor fires were harder to maintain, leading to greater reliance on the covered field kitchen that had been constructed during the dry months. The large iron stoves, fueled with wood that had to be kept meticulously dry, became the center of camp life as men gathered near them for warmth and comfort. In the Crimean War, Father Gregory recounted during one particularly wet evening, soldiers suffered more from poor food storage than from enemy action. Supplies rotted in the rain, and scurvy ran rampant. We have learned much since then, but nature still challenges our best efforts. The prison facility required special attention during the rains. Water seeped through the walls, requiring constant maintenance to keep the cells habitable. Prisoners were given additional blankets and were permitted to spend more time in the covered common area rather than confined to damp cells. It was a practical humanitarian decision. Sick prisoners were a burden on the camp's medical resources. The wet weather brought an unexpected benefit: fewer disciplinary problems. Men were too focused on staying dry and warm to engage in the petty conflicts that arose during idle times. The exception was an increase in gambling, as soldiers sought entertainment during the long, wet evenings. Alexei tolerated small-stakes card games but drew the line at dice, which too often led to accusations of cheating in subsequent fights. Food during the rainy season took on extra importance for morale. Murat ensured that hot soup was available throughout the day, keeping large pots simmering constantly. The warmth and nourishment provided physical comfort, while the familiar routine of mealtimes gave structure to days when outdoor training was impossible. As Christmas approached, the rain gave way to clearer skies, and the camp took on a festive atmosphere despite being far from home. The mix of Orthodox, Muslim, and Catholic traditions among the Circassian cavalry created an interesting cultural blend, with the holiday becoming more about universal fellowship than specific religious observance. Preparations for the Christmas feast began weeks in advance. Ibrahim negotiated with local suppliers for special ingredients: a whole pig, chickens, fresh fish, and luxuries like chocolate and coffee. The men contributed from their pay to a common fund, ensuring that even the poorest soldiers would partake in the celebration. The Christmas Eve dinner was a masterpiece of military logistics and culinary skill. Murat and his team worked for 2 days preparing dishes that honored various traditions. There was roasted meat with herbs, fish prepared in the Orthodox tradition for those observing the fast, flatbreads and honey cakes from Circassian recipes, and Chilean specialties provided by friendly locals. Food is memory, Alexei observed, watching his men enjoy the feast. Each taste brings them home, if only for a moment. This is why we make such effort for these occasions, not for the stomach alone, but for the soul. Even the prisoners were included in the celebration. They received the same special meal as the rest of the camp, and were permitted to join the general gathering for the evening entertainment, though under guard. It was a reminder that military justice, while necessary, need not exclude mercy. The British delegation extended their stay for the holiday, contributed plum pudding and navy rum to the feast. Colonel Hartwell raised a toast to soldiers far from home, united in service. May the new year bring peace, but if war must come, may we face it with the courage and brotherhood I have witnessed here. The evening concluded with music and storytelling. Men shared tales from their homelands, sang traditional songs, and for a few hours, the military hierarchy relaxed into simple human fellowship. The sound of laughter and song drifted across the camp, mixing with the distant sound of the sea. January 1915 arrived with crystal clear skies and a sense of anticipation. News from Europe grew increasingly ominous, and everyone sensed that their peaceful interlude in Coronel was drawing to a close. The morning light revealed a camp that had evolved significantly over the past months. Alexei stood at his usual observation point, watching the sunrise paint the Pacific in shades of gold and blue. The camp below him stirred to life with practiced efficiency, fires kindled, horses fed, men beginning their daily routines. The food systems they had established now ran like clockwork, a testament to military discipline and adaptation. The morning inspection revealed stores in excellent condition despite the recent rains. Ibrahim's meticulous management had prevented any significant losses, and the relationships built with local suppliers ensured steady provisions. The combination of preserved military rations and fresh local food had kept the men healthy and morale high. "We have created something remarkable here," Ibrahim observed, showing Alexei the latest inventory reports. "Our preservation techniques have improved, our men are well fed, and we have maintained discipline without harsh measures. If war comes, these lessons will serve us well." The prison logs for the past month showed a marked decrease in infractions. Whether due to the improved food situation, the approaching uncertainty of war, or simply the maturation of young soldiers, the camp had achieved a remarkable level of harmony. The few prisoners currently confined were there for minor offenses, missed curfew, minor insubordination, and would be released within days. Trial procedures had been refined through practice and the exchange of ideas with the British observers. A standardized system now existed for documenting offenses, conducting hearings, and recording punishments. It balanced efficiency with fairness, ensuring that justice was swift but not arbitrary. The afternoon sun warmed the camp as Alexei made his way to the field bakery, a recent addition that had transformed their bread supply. The smell of baking bread drifted across the camp, a comfort that transcended all cultures and reminded every man of home. The bakery was Murat's particular pride, constructed with local materials but following designs learned from French military bakers. A large clay oven, reinforced with iron bands, could produce 50 loaves at a time. The process began before dawn, with dough mixed in the cool morning air when fermentation could be better controlled. "Bread is civilization," Murat explained to a group of younger soldiers he was training. "Any army can slaughter meat, any fool can boil water for soup. But bread requires knowledge, patience, skill. It transforms simple grain into the staff of life." The flour came from various sources, some imported wheat flour for white bread, local cornmeal for flatbreads, and rye flour when available for the dark, dense loaves that many of the men preferred. Each type required different handling, different proportions of water and salt, different baking times and temperatures. Military bread had to meet specific requirements. It needed to remain edible for several days without refrigeration, be sturdy enough to transport without crumbling, yet palatable enough to maintain morale. The solution was a medium-density loaf with a thick crust that protected the interior while allowing moisture to escape slowly. During Napoleon's campaigns, Colonel Hartwell contributed during one of his visits to the bakery. The French developed pain de munition, ammunition bread, so called because it was as essential as bullets. It was heavy, dark, and would last a week. We've improved since then, but the principle remains. The bakery also produced hardtack, though no one pretended to enjoy it. The process was simple but precise: flour, water, and salt mixed to a stiff dough, rolled thin, cut into squares, and baked slowly until completely dry. The resulting biscuits were nearly indestructible, capable of surviving months of storage and rough handling. February brought the wine harvest season to the region around Coronel, and with it, increased interaction between the cavalry camp and local civilians. These exchanges enriched both the camp's food supply and the cultural understanding between the Circassians and their Chilean hosts. An elderly Chilean farmer named Don Carlos had become a regular visitor to the camp, bringing fresh produce and homemade cheese in exchange for help with heavy farm work. His broken Spanish mixed with gestures created a universal language of commerce and friendship. My grandfather, Don Carlos, told them through an interpreter one evening, fought in the War of the Pacific. He would be amazed to see Russian horsemen here, buying our food, protecting our land. The world grows smaller, no? These civilian interactions provided insights into local food preservation techniques adapted to the specific climate of coastal Chile. The locals used a method of air-drying meat called charca, from which the English word jerky derived. The meat was cut into strips, salted, and hung in the dry wind that came down from the Andes, creating a preserved protein that could last months. The camp's justice system occasionally intersected with civilian matters. When a local merchant accused a soldier of theft, Alexei had to navigate the delicate balance between military justice and civilian law. The investigation, conducted with scrupulous fairness, revealed a misunderstanding rather than actual theft, and the matter was resolved with compensation and apologies. These incidents highlighted the importance of food in maintaining civil-military relations. By purchasing fairly from local suppliers, respecting local customs around food and hospitality, and sharing their own culinary traditions, the Circassian cavalry built bridges that transcended language and cultural barriers. The local prison, which Alexei visited as part of his liaison duties, provided an interesting contrast to military detention. Conditions were harsher, with prisoners receiving minimal rations of beans, rice, and occasional meat. There was no systematic attempt at rehabilitation, merely containment. It reinforced his belief that military justice, for all its strictness, contained an element of paternalistic care absent from civilian criminal systems. March arrived with increasingly urgent telegrams from Europe. War had indeed come, though Chile remained neutral. The camp began preparations for potential departure, and with it, intensive focus on food preservation and emergency rations. Ibrahim supervised the creation of emergency food supplies that could sustain the unit during rapid movement or potential combat. Iron rations, the emergency food carried by each soldier, were assembled with careful attention to nutrition, preservation, and weight. Each man's emergency kit contained hardtack biscuits wrapped in waterproof paper, a tin of preserved meat, a small packet of tea and sugar, salt tablets, and dried fruit. These items could sustain a soldier for 3 days if necessary, though they were intended only for true emergencies. In battle, Alexei explained to his officers, supply lines are the first casualty. A soldier who knows he has food in his pack fights with greater confidence. Hunger destroys armies more surely than bullets. The preservation techniques were tested rigorously. Meat was preserved using multiple methods, salting, smoking, and canning, to ensure redundancy. Vegetables were pickled, dried, and preserved in oil. Even eggs were preserved, carefully coated in mineral oil or packed in water glass solution, methods that could keep them edible for months. The camp kitchen conducted exercises in rapid meal preparation, simulating conditions where cooking fires might attract enemy attention. Cold rations were developed, combinations of preserved foods that could provide nutrition without cooking. Compressed soup tablets, dissolved in cold water if necessary, provided minerals and some calories. Chocolate, when available, was included for quick energy and morale. The prison routines were also modified for potential wartime conditions. Protocols were established for managing prisoners during movement, ensuring they would be neither abandoned nor become a security risk. It was decided that minor offenders would be released to regular duty in case of emergency deployment, while serious offenders would be transferred to Chilean civilian authority. April's mild weather provided perfect conditions for food preservation experiments. The camp had become a laboratory where ancient techniques met modern science, each method carefully tested and documented for future use. A visiting Chilean professor of chemistry, invited by Colonel Hartwell, gave lectures on the scientific principles behind food preservation. His explanations, translated into multiple languages, fascinated the soldiers who had practiced these techniques without fully understanding why they worked. Salt, the professor explained, using simple diagrams drawn on a portable blackboard, draws water from food through osmosis. Bacteria need water to survive. No water, no bacteria, no spoilage. This is why salt has been precious throughout history. It is life itself, preserved. The smoking process was revealed to work through multiple mechanisms. The heat killed bacteria, the smoke contained chemicals that inhibited bacterial growth, and the drying effect removed moisture. The optimal temperature range, the best woods to use, the proper duration, all were explained in scientific terms that complemented the traditional knowledge. Fermentation, used in making sauerkraut and pickled vegetables, was explained as controlled bacterial growth, beneficial bacteria producing acid that prevented harmful organisms from thriving. The men learned to recognize the signs of proper fermentation versus dangerous spoilage. Knowledge is power, Alexei told his men after one such lecture. Understanding why our preservation methods work allows us to adapt them to new conditions, new foods. This science serves the same purpose as military drill, turning instinct into reliable technique. The camp's experiments with pemmican, a concentrated food invented by North American indigenous peoples, proved particularly successful. Made from dried meat, rendered fat, and dried berries, it provided maximum nutrition in minimum space. A small block could sustain a man for a full day of hard labor. May brought orders that the Circassian cavalry would depart Coronel by month's end. The news spread through the camp like morning mist, bringing a mixture of anticipation and melancholy. The peaceful interlude was ending, and with it, the carefully constructed world they had built. The final weeks were spent in intensive preparation. Food stores were inventoried, with some designated for travel and others donated to local charitable institutions. The preservation techniques developed and refined over the months were documented in detailed manuals that would serve future military units. Murat trained local assistants in the operation of the field bakery, ensuring that the Chilean military would benefit from the knowledge exchange. Recipes were written down, techniques demonstrated repeatedly, the oral tradition of military cooking transformed into written record. The prison was emptied of its few remaining occupants, their sentences commuted in light of the unit's departure. Each man was given a clean record and full rations for the journey ahead. It was a gesture of unity, whatever their past infractions. They were Circassian cavalry, brothers in arms facing an uncertain future. The final feast was a bittersweet affair. Local dignitaries joined the camp for a meal that showcased both Circassian traditions and Chilean hospitality. The tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fresh breads, preserved fruits, and local wines. It was abundance in the face of uncertainty, celebration shadowed by approaching darkness. "We came here as strangers," Alexei said in his farewell speech, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "We leave as friends. The food we have shared, the traditions we have exchanged, the justice we have administered fairly, these create bonds that distance cannot break." Don Carlos, the old farmer, presented the unit with wheels of aged cheese and cases of preserved fruits for their journey. "For the road," he said simply, tears in his weathered eyes. "May you never hunger, wherever your path leads." The morning of departure dawned clear and cool, with a light mist rising from the Pacific. The camp that had been home for over a year was struck with military efficiency, leaving only the permanent structures that would serve future occupants. The food preparations for the journey were magnificent in their complexity. Each man carried personal rations for 5 days, while supply wagons held preserved foods for 3 weeks. Everything was packed with careful attention to weight distribution and protection from weather. Ibrahim's final inventory was a masterwork of military logistics. 2,000 pounds of hardtack, wrapped in waterproof canvas. 500 pounds of preserved meat in various forms. 300 pounds of dried vegetables. 200 pounds of coffee and tea. 100 pounds of sugar and salt. Cases of canned goods from various nations. Barrels of pickled vegetables. Sacks of flour and rice. "This food," he said, closing his ledger with a satisfied snap, "represents not just sustenance but civilization." Each item tells a story, of trade routes spanning oceans, of preservation techniques refined over centuries, of human ingenuity in the face of nature's challenges. The horses were loaded with their own provisions, oats and hay compressed into manageable bales, supplements of salt and minerals. The cavalry's mounts were not mere transportation but comrades, requiring the same careful attention to nutrition as the men. As the column formed for departure, the sound of horses' hooves on packed earth created a rhythmic pattern that had echoed through history. The men sat straight in their saddles, their supplies secured, their futures uncertain but their preparations complete. The camp kitchen, that heart of military life, was the last thing dismantled. The great pots were cleaned one final time, packed carefully in wooden crates marked with the regiment's insignia. Murat supervised personally, ensuring that each piece was properly wrapped and stored. "These pots," he said softly, running his hand along the worn iron, "have fed armies, sustained life, created community. They deserve respect." As the Circassian cavalry wound their way along the coastal road, leaving Coronel behind, the rhythmic movement of the horses and the sound of the sea created a meditative atmosphere. Each man was alone with his thoughts, yet united in their shared journey. The midday halt for food was a practiced ritual, executed with the efficiency born of months of training. Cold rations were distributed, hardtack softened with water, preserved meat, dried fruit. It was simple fare, but sufficient, and eaten with the appreciation of men who understood the effort required to provide it. "Do you remember," one soldier said to another, "when Private Barakov was caught stealing extra rations? How hungry he was. Now we all eat the same, and there is enough." The story had become part of unit lore, a reminder that military justice served not just to punish but to ensure fairness. Barakov himself, riding with his squad, had become one of the most reliable soldiers, his early transgression transformed into understanding of why rules existed. As evening approached, they made camp in a field overlooking the ocean. The portable field kitchens were assembled, fires kindled, and the first hot meal of the journey prepared. It was a simple stew, but the smell of cooking food transformed a temporary stopping place into a home, however briefly. Alexei walked among his men, observing the easy efficiency with which they established their camp. The routines developed in Coronel served them well. Everyone knew their duties, from gathering firewood to setting up the supply tents. The months of practice had created muscle memory that would serve them in whatever challenges lay ahead. That night, under stars brilliant in the clear sky, the men shared stories of meals remembered, of foods from their homeland they missed, of the Chilean dishes they had learned to enjoy. Food became the thread that wove their experiences together, the common language that transcended all barriers. In years to come, Alexei thought, watching his men around their fires, they will remember not the drills or the discipline, but the meals shared, the bread broken together, the simple act of sustaining life that makes us human. Years later, when the Great War had transformed from future threat to historical memory, veterans of the Circassian cavalry would gather to share their recollections. Invariably, their stories would return to that peaceful year in Coronel, when they learned that an army's strength lay not in its weapons but in its ability to sustain itself. The techniques they had developed for food preservation would serve them through the chaos that followed. Ibrahim's meticulous record-keeping became the model for military logistics in their later campaigns. Murat's recipes, copied and shared, fed soldiers on multiple fronts. The fusion of traditional knowledge with modern science created innovations that saved countless lives. The approach to military justice developed in Coronel, firm but fair, focused on rehabilitation rather than mere punishment, influenced military legal systems in the post-war period. The principle that a soldier's dignity must be preserved even in punishment became accepted doctrine. But perhaps the greatest lesson was simpler, that food is more than fuel for the body. It is memory, culture, comfort, and community. In the act of preparing and sharing meals, strangers become comrades, military units become families, and temporary camps become homes. The camp at Coronel, with its careful balance of discipline and humanity, its fusion of traditions from multiple cultures, its emphasis on sustaining both body and spirit, represented a moment of civilization in an increasingly uncivilized time. The men who passed through it carried its lessons forward, seeds planted in foreign soil that would bloom in unexpected places. As the sun sets on our tale, painting the Pacific in the same golden hues that welcomed the Circassian cavalry to Coronel, we are reminded that history is made not just in great battles or political chambers, but in the daily acts of sustaining life. The simple act of feeding an army, of maintaining justice, of preserving food against spoilage, these mundane miracles are the true substance of military life. The sound of the sea continues its eternal rhythm, waves breaking against the shore where once a military camp stood. The buildings are gone, the men scattered to history, but the lessons remain, that civilization is fragile and must be actively maintained, that justice must be tempered with mercy, and that in the breaking of bread together, we affirm our common humanity. And so, as sleep approaches and the story draws to its close, let the gentle rhythm of horses' hooves on distant roads, the soft bubbling of stew in iron pots, the quiet murmur of soldiers sharing their evening meal, carry you into peaceful dreams. For in these simple sounds lies the true heartbeat of history, not the thunder of guns or the shouts of battle, but the quiet persistence of life sustained, one meal, one day, one preserved tradition at a time. The Circassian cavalry have long since passed into memory, their careful records of rations and punishments yellowed with age. But in the techniques they perfected, the justice they administered, the community they built around their cooking fires, they left a legacy that transcends their moment in history. They proved that even in preparation for war, humanity could flourish, that even in military discipline, compassion could exist, and that in the simple act of preserving and sharing food, we preserve and share our very souls. Sleep now, and dream of distant camps where the smell of baking bread mingles with sea salt, where military precision meets human kindness, and where the careful preservation of food becomes a metaphor for the preservation of civilization itself. The story of what World War I food was really like is, in the end, the story of human ingenuity, adaptation, and the irrepressible urge to create community wherever we find ourselves, one shared meal at a time.